Sarah was excited about her first babysitting job. She was just 16, but she felt responsible and mature enough to take care of the Johnsons' 3-year-old daughter, Emily. The Johnsons lived in a large, old house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. Sarah arrived promptly at 7 p.m., greeted warmly by Mrs. Johnson before she and her husband hurried out for the dinner reservation. Alone with Emily, Sarah set about her duties. They played games, read stories, and had snacks. As the evening progressed, Sarah started feeling uneasy. It was nothing concrete, just a sense of being watched that made her skin prickle. She shook it off, attributing it to nerves from being in a new environment. After putting Emily to bed, Sarah settled on the couch to watch TV. She tried to ignore the feeling of unease creeping over her. Then, she heard it, a faint scratching sound, like claws on wood. She muted the TV, straining her ears to listen. The scratching grew louder, closer. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced nervously around the dimly lit room. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to guide her. She crept through the house, her heart racing with each creak of the floorboards. The scratching sound seemed to follow her, echoing through the silent house. Just as Sarah reached the hallway leading to Emily's room, she heard a blood-curdling scream pierce the silence. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she sprinted towards Emily's room, her mind racing with fear. When she flung open the door, she found Emily sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face. "There's a monster in my closet, Sarah," she wailed. Sarah's blood ran cold as she approached the closet cautiously. With trembling hands, she reached for the door handle and swung it open. To her horror, there was nothing there but clothes hanging neatly on hangers. Relieved, Sarah reassured Emily that there was no monster and tucked her back into bed. But as she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Just then, she heard a low growl behind her. Whipping around, she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at her from the darkness of the hallway. Frozen in terror, Sarah watched as a monstrous creature emerged from the shadows, a grotesque, twisted figure with razor-sharp claws and jagged teeth. With a scream of terror, Sarah bolted towards the front door, praying she could make it out alive. But as she reached for the handle, she felt a searing pain in her leg and collapsed to the ground. As darkness consumed her, Sarah realized she was just another victim of the babysitter horror story that would haunt the Johnsons' house for years to come. Story 2. It was a typical Friday evening when Jenna, a seasoned babysitter, arrived at the Thompsons' house to watch their 2 children, Tommy and Lily. The parents left detailed instructions, kissed their kids goodbye, and headed out for their date night. As the night progressed, everything seemed to be going smoothly. Jenna and the kids played games, watched movies, and even baked cookies together. Tommy and Lily were well behaved, and Jenna felt at ease in the familiar surroundings of the Thompsons' home. As bedtime approached, Jenna helped the kids brush their teeth and tucked them into bed. She read them a bedtime story and kissed them goodnight before turning off the lights and closing their bedroom door. With the kids asleep, Jenna settled on the couch to relax and wait for the Thompsons to return. Hours passed, and Jenna found herself dozing off on the couch. Suddenly, she was jolted awake by a loud noise coming from upstairs. She frowned, wondering if one of the kids had woken up. Climbing the stairs cautiously, she listened for any signs of disturbance. At the top of the stairs, Jenna froze in horror. The door to Tommy and Lily's bedroom was wide open, and she could hear muffled voices coming from inside. Heart pounding, she approached the room slowly, her mind racing with fear. Peeking inside, Jenna's blood turned to ice. Standing in the middle of the room were Tommy and Lily, their eyes wide with terror as they stared at something unseen in the corner. Jenna followed their gaze and felt her stomach churn with dread. There, in the darkness, stood a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette with glowing eyes and a sinister aura. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of her imagination? Before she could make sense of it, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving Jenna shaken to the core. She rushed to comfort Tommy and Lily, reassuring them that everything was okay. But deep down, she knew that something wasn't right. When the Thompsons returned home, Jenna recounted her unsettling experience, expecting them to laugh it off as a trick of the imagination. But to her surprise, their faces turned pale as they exchanged worried glances. As it turned out, the Thompsons had been experiencing strange occurrences in their house for weeks: unexplained noises, mysterious shadows, and the feeling of being watched. They had hoped it was just their imagination running wild, but Jenna's encounter confirmed their worst fears. In the days that followed, the Thompsons hired a paranormal investigator to examine their home. What they discovered sent chills down their spines. Their house was haunted by the restless spirit of a former resident who had met a tragic end years ago. From that day on, Jenna vowed never to babysit alone in a house with a dark history, haunted by the lingering echoes of the past. Story 3. It was a stormy night when Megan arrived at the Johnsons' house for her babysitting gig. The wind howled outside, and rain pounded against the windows as Mr. and Mrs. Johnson hurriedly left for their anniversary dinner, leaving Megan alone with their two children, Alex and Sophie. As Megan settled in, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gripped her. The old house seemed to creak and groan with every gust of wind, and shadows danced menacingly in the dimly lit rooms. But she brushed off her nerves and focused on keeping the kids entertained. As bedtime approached, Megan helped Alex and Sophie get ready for bed. She read them a bedtime story and tucked them in, promising to check on them later. With the kids asleep, Megan retreated to the living room to unwind. Hours passed, and Megan found herself nodding off on the couch. She was awoken suddenly by a loud crash coming from upstairs. Heart racing, she bolted upright, listening intently for any other sounds. When she heard nothing but the sound of rain, Megan hesitantly made her way upstairs to investigate. As she reached the top of the stairs, she froze in horror. The door to Alex and Sophie's room was wide open, and a cold draft swept through the hallway. Megan's pulse quickened as she stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of trouble. That's when she saw it: a figure standing at the foot of Alex's bed, its back turned to her. Megan's breath caught in her throat as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Who, or what, was in the room with her? Summoning all her courage, Megan called out, "Who's there?" The figure remained motionless for a moment before slowly turning to face her. In the dim light, Megan could see its twisted features and glowing eyes, a sight that sent shivers down her spine. With a strangled cry, Megan turned and fled from the room, the sound of her own footsteps echoing in her ears. She raced downstairs, grabbing her phone and dialing 911 as she went. Within minutes, police arrived at the Johnsons' house, but when they searched the premises, they found no sign of an intruder. Megan was left shaken and bewildered, unable to explain what she had seen. In the days that followed, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, seemed to remind her of that terrifying night at the Johnsons' house. And as she lay awake at night, listening to the sounds of the storm outside, Megan couldn't help but wonder, what other horrors lurked in the darkness, waiting to be uncovered? Story 4. The Hamiltons' mansion stood secluded at the edge of town, surrounded by sprawling gardens and ancient oak trees. It was a grand and imposing structure, with ivy-covered walls and towering turrets that seemed to pierce the stormy sky. Inside, the house was a maze of dimly lit corridors and shadowy rooms, filled with antique furniture and whispered secrets. On a cold winter's night, Emily, a college student looking to earn some extra cash, arrived at the Hamiltons' doorstep for her first babysitting job. Mrs. Hamilton greeted her warmly, introducing her to their two children, James and Lily, before rushing out the door with her husband for a charity gala. As the night descended and the wind howled outside, Emily settled in with James and Lily, determined to make the best of her evening. But as the hours passed, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if the very walls of the house held secrets that whispered to her in the darkness. As bedtime approached, Emily helped James and Lily get ready for bed, reading them a bedtime story and tucking them in before retreating to the living room to relax. But no sooner had she settled onto the couch than strange things began to happen. The lights flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Emily's heart raced as she glanced nervously around the room, her senses on high alert. Then, she heard it, a faint scratching sound, like claws on wood, coming from somewhere in the house. Brushing it off as her imagination, Emily tried to focus on the TV, but the scratching grew louder, more insistent. With a sinking feeling in her stomach, she realized that something was terribly wrong. Summoning her courage, Emily crept through the darkened corridors, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She followed the sound of the scratching, her heart pounding in her chest, until she reached the attic, a place she had been explicitly told to avoid. As she hesitated at the foot of the attic stairs, Emily felt a cold chill run down her spine. But she knew she had to confront whatever was lurking in the darkness. With trembling hands, she ascended the stairs, her breath catching in her throat as she pushed open the attic door. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. Huddled in the corner of the attic was a figure, a twisted, grotesque creature with glowing eyes and razor-sharp claws. Emily's mind reeled as she struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of her imagination? But as the creature turned to face her, its eyes filled with malice, Emily knew that it was all too real. With a strangled cry, she turned and fled from the attic, the sound of the creature's unearthly wail echoing in her ears. Downstairs, Emily found James and Lily huddled together in fear, their eyes wide with terror. She knew she had to get them out of the house, to safety, before it was too late. Grabbing the children's hands, Emily dashed for the front door, throwing it open and racing out into the night. Behind her, she could hear the sound of the creature's claws scraping against the floorboards, its unearthly wail growing louder with each passing moment. But just as they reached the safety of the driveway, Emily stumbled and fell to the ground, her ankle twisted in the darkness. Desperate and afraid, she looked up to see the creature looming over her, its eyes burning with hatred. In that moment of terror, Emily knew that they were all doomed, that the darkness that lurked within the Hamiltons' mansion would consume them all. Story 5. It was a crisp autumn evening when Lisa arrived at the Smiths' house to babysit the two young children, Timmy and Jenny. The Smiths were running late for the dinner reservation and rushed out the door after giving Lisa a quick rundown of the evening's routine. As darkness fell outside, Lisa settled in with the kids, playing games and watching movies to pass the time. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease settled over her. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As Lisa tucked Timmy and Jenny into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She brushed it off as nerves and reassured herself that everything was fine. But when she went downstairs to the living room, she noticed something strange. A framed photograph on the mantel had been turned upside down. Puzzled, Lisa approached the photograph and reached out to turn it back around. But as her fingers brushed against the glass, she heard a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the house. Heart pounding, Lisa froze in terror, her mind racing with fear. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew that something was terribly wrong. Summoning her courage, Lisa crept through the darkened house, her senses on high alert. She checked every room, searching for any sign of an intruder, but found nothing out of the ordinary. That is, until she reached the basement. As Lisa descended the creaky stairs into the dimly lit basement, she felt a chill run down her spine. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay, and shadows danced menacingly on the walls. Then, she saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her from the darkness. Lisa's blood ran cold as she realized that she was not alone in the basement. There was something down there with her, something sinister and malevolent. With a strangled cry, Lisa turned and fled from the basement, her heart pounding in her chest. She raced upstairs, grabbed her phone, and dialed 911, her hands trembling with fear. Within minutes, police arrived at the Smiths' house and conducted a thorough search of the premises. But when they emerged from the basement, they found nothing out of the ordinary, no intruder, no sign of forced entry, nothing. As Lisa tried to make sense of what had happened, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was alive, that it was hiding secrets far darker than she could ever imagine. And as she left the Smiths' house that night, she couldn't help but wonder what other horrors lurked within its walls, waiting to be unleashed. This story plays on the classic fear of the unknown, with a sense of tension and suspense building as the protagonist explores the eerie house. Story 6. It was a moonless night when Amy arrived at the Williams remote cabin nestled deep in the woods. The Williams had planned a rare night out, leaving Amy in charge of their 2 children, Emma and Jacob. The cabin was quaint, with a rustic charm that seemed comforting in the daylight but took on an eerie quality as darkness enveloped the surrounding forest. Amy settled in with the kids, engaging them in board games and storytelling to pass the time. But as the night stretched on, strange occurrences began to unfold. The cabin seemed to groan and creak with each gust of wind, and Amy couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. As bedtime approached, Amy helped Emma and Jacob get ready for bed, tucking them in and assuring them that everything was okay. But as she made her way to the living room, she heard a soft whispering coming from the hallway. Heart racing, Amy followed the sound to Emma's room, where she found the young girl sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong, Emma?" Amy asked, her voice trembling with apprehension. Emma pointed to the closet, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something in there, Amy." "Something? Watching me?" Amy's blood ran cold as she approached the closet cautiously. With trembling hands, she reached for the door handle and swung it open, revealing nothing but clothes and toys neatly arranged on the shelves. Relieved, Amy reassured Emma that there was nothing to be afraid of and tucked her back into bed. But as she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Just then, she heard a loud thud coming from the attic, followed by the sound of footsteps echoing through the cabin. Amy's heart skipped a beat as she realized that they were not alone in the house. Summoning her courage, Amy crept up the stairs to the attic, her senses on high alert. As she reached the top, she saw the attic door slowly swing open, revealing a dark and foreboding space beyond. With a deep breath, Amy stepped into the attic, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. What she saw next would haunt her for the rest of her days. Standing in the corner of the attic was a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette with glowing eyes and a menacing aura. Amy's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the creature, paralyzed with fear. But as the figure advanced towards her, its movements slow and deliberate, Amy knew that she had to act fast. With a scream of terror, she turned and fled from the attic, the sound of her own footsteps echoing in the darkness. Downstairs, she found Emma and Jacob huddled together, their eyes wide with terror. Without hesitation, Amy grabbed the children and fled from the cabin, never looking back as she raced into the night. As they reached the safety of the forest, Amy realized that they had narrowly escaped a fate far worse than she could have ever imagined. And as they made their way back to civilization, she vowed never to return to that remote cabin in the woods, haunted by the memory of the sinister presence that lurked within its walls. Story 7. It was a stormy night when Sarah arrived at the Johnsons' house for her babysitting job. The Johnsons' home was a grand Victorian mansion, looming ominously against the backdrop of the raging storm. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine as she stepped inside, greeted by Mrs. Johnson's hurried instructions and the anxious faces of their 2 children, Emily and Michael. As the storm raged outside, Sarah tried to keep the kids distracted with games and movies. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease settled over her. It was as if the storm had brought with it a malevolent presence that seeped into the very walls of the mansion. As bedtime approached, Sarah helped Emily and Michael get ready for bed, tucking them in and assuring them that everything would be okay. But as she made her way to the living room, she heard a soft whispering coming from the shadows. Heart pounding, Sarah followed the sound to the hallway, where she saw a flickering light coming from the basement. With a sinking feeling in her stomach, she realized that she would have to confront whatever lurked in the darkness below. Summoning her courage, Sarah descended into the basement, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The flickering light led her to a door at the far end of the room, its surface covered in strange symbols and runes. With trembling hands, Sarah pushed open the door and stepped into the darkness beyond. What she saw next would haunt her for the rest of her days. In the center of the room was a circle of candles, their flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. And standing in the center of the circle was a figure, a twisted, grotesque creature with glowing eyes and razor-sharp claws. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the creature, her mind reeling with fear. It was like something out of a nightmare, a creature of pure darkness and malevolence, summoned from the depths of the underworld. But before Sarah could react, the creature lunged towards her, its claws outstretched and its eyes burning with hatred. With a scream of terror, Sarah turned and fled from the basement, the sound of the creature's unearthly wail echoing in her ears. Upstairs, she found Emily and Michael huddled together, their eyes wide with terror. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed the children and fled from the mansion, the storm raging outside matching the chaos within. As they reached the safety of the outside world, Sarah realized that they had narrowly escaped a fate far worse than she could have ever imagined. And as they made their way back to civilization, she vowed never to return to that accursed mansion, haunted by the memory of the creature that lurked in its depths.